A mother was trapped, helpless, as a train sped toward them with no way out. Sienna, a wild mustang, had roamed free her entire life, until now. Chained to the railroad tracks, she could not escape. Her newborn foal, Dakota, trembled beside her. The metal rails vibrated beneath them, and a distant whistle pierced the evening air. Time was running out. Then, headlights cut through the dusk. A rancher, Wyatt Lawson, skidded to a stop. He had only seconds to act. The question was, would he be fast enough? What happened next will leave you speechless. Stay with us for a story of courage, fate, and an unbreakable bond that defies all odds. The desert stretched endlessly beneath the fading sun, its golden hues blending into the vast sky. The wind carried whispers of the wild, rustling through dry brush and stirring up clouds of dust. It was a place of freedom. Untamed, boundless. But tonight, that freedom was being stolen. Sienna stood frozen, her muscles trembling as the cold iron bit into her legs. Heavy chains bound her to the railroad tracks, their weight unnatural and cruel. Beside her, Dakota, barely a few days old, stumbled weakly, his small frame pressing against her side. His breath came in quick, frightened gasps. He did not understand what was happening, only that his mother was afraid. And that was enough to terrify him. The tracks beneath them vibrated. A low, distant hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Sienna flared her nostrils, her ears flicking wildly. The scent of oil and burning metal drifted toward them, the smell of an unstoppable force. A train was coming. Panic surged through her. She reared back, her hooves scraping against the ground as she fought the chains with every ounce of strength left in her body. But the iron would not yield. The more she struggled, the tighter they held. Dakota let out a sharp whimper, his legs buckling as he collapsed beneath her. And then, headlights. A pair of bright beams cut through the desert dusk, bouncing over uneven ground as a truck skidded to a stop just beyond the tracks. The driver's door flew open, and a man leaped out, his boots kicking up a cloud of dust. Wyatt Lawson barely had time to process what he was seeing. His heart slammed against his ribs as he took in the sight before him. A mustang, chained to the tracks, her foal trembling at her side. And the train. It was too close. Wyatt's instincts took over. Sprinting forward, he dropped to his knees beside the chains, his hands fumbling with the rusted locks. His fingers burned as he fought against the metal, desperation flooding through him. Come on, he muttered, sweat dripping down his brow. Sienna's eyes locked onto his, wide and filled with fear. But she did not lash out. Somehow, she knew he was her only chance. The ground rumbled. The train's whistle screamed through the night. Wyatt's pulse pounded in his ears. He yanked at the lock with all his strength, but it would not budge. His hands flew to his belt, his knife. With one swift motion, he pulled it free and began sawing at the thick rope securing the chains. Seconds. He had only seconds. Dakota let out a desperate cry, struggling to stand as the rails beneath them shook violently. Sienna flinched but did not move. Her instincts screamed at her to protect her foal, even if it meant standing between him and death itself. Wyatt roared in frustration, slicing harder. The rope frayed, tore, and then snapped. The chains loosened. Sienna lurched forward, stumbling as Wyatt ripped the last of the restraints away. "Go," he shouted, shoving at her side. She hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. Then she turned, nipped at Dakota's mane, and together they bolted off the tracks. Wyatt barely had time to throw himself backward before the train thundered past, a monstrous blur of steel and speed. The force of it sent him rolling across the dirt, his lungs burning with dust. When the last car finally screeched by, silence fell over the desert once more. Wyatt pushed himself up, his breath ragged, his hands still shaking. Slowly, his eyes found Sienna and Dakota standing a few yards away, their silhouettes framed against the moonless sand. She was staring at him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without a sound, Sienna turned, nudged her foal forward, and disappeared into the darkness. Wyatt exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. He had saved them, but something told him this was not the end. It was only the beginning. Wyatt stood frozen, his breath still uneven from the rush of what had just happened. The mustang and her foal had vanished into the desert, swallowed by the night. But deep inside, he knew this was far from over. He turned back toward his truck, wiping sweat and dust from his face. His hands still trembled from the adrenaline. He had never seen anything like that before. Wild horses, deliberately chained to railroad tracks. This was not an accident. It was not nature. Someone had done this on purpose, and that meant those men were still out there. A bad feeling settled in his gut as he climbed into the driver's seat, his knuckles whitening around the steering wheel. Whoever had tried to kill that Mustang and her foal had a reason for it, and Wyatt had just interfered with their plans. He turned the key. The truck rumbled to life. Miles away, hidden in the thick shadows of the canyon, something or someone was watching. Cole Sanders sat on horseback, his narrowed eyes scanning the desert, his lips twisting in anger. "They got away," he muttered. The younger man beside him, Bobby Greaves, shifted nervously in his saddle. "I told you we should have stayed closer," he said, his hands tightening on the reins. Cole spat into the dirt, frustration simmering beneath his skin. His patience was wearing thin. He had spent weeks tracking that Mustang, waiting for the perfect moment to claim her. Wild Mustangs meant money, and Sienna was no ordinary Mustang. She was a prize, a rare beauty, powerful and fast, exactly what the buyers were willing to pay for. But now, thanks to some no-name rancher, she was gone. Cole's fingers clenched around the reins. "We will find them," he growled. "And this time, we will not leave any witnesses." Wyatt drove in silence, his mind racing. He should have gone home, left well enough alone, but something about this did not sit right with him. He had grown up around wild horses. He knew their ways, their struggles. But this was not nature. This was cruelty. And he was not the kind of man to turn his back on it. Instead of heading back to his ranch, he veered toward an old, abandoned outpost deep in the valley. It was a place the Mustangs often sought for shelter, especially after storms or long migrations. If the mare was injured, if the foal was weak, they might have stopped there to rest. He had to make sure they were safe. As he reached the outpost, he killed the headlights and stepped out, his boots crunching softly against the dry earth. The desert stretched wide and silent around him, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl breaking the stillness. Then, movement. His hand went instinctively to the knife on his belt. A shadow flickered near the broken wooden fence. A set of glowing eyes reflected the moonlight. Then, a soft snort. Wyatt exhaled slowly. It was her. Sienna stood near the fence line, her body tense, her instincts still on high alert. She was not alone. Dakota stood close to her legs, his tiny frame trembling in the cold night air. Wyatt took a cautious step forward. "Easy, girl," he murmured. Sienna did not move, but she did not run either. She simply watched him, her dark eyes filled with something he could not quite place. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small apple he had taken from his truck. Holding it out, he stepped forward slowly. The Mustang's nostrils flared. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then, cautiously, she lowered her head, sniffed the apple, and after a brief hesitation, took it. Wyatt let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Maybe, just maybe, she knew he was not the enemy. But then, the wind shifted. A chill ran down Wyatt's spine. In the distance, a low rumble. Engines, his jaw tightened. Whoever had done this, they were not finished. They were coming back. The desert air grew colder, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. Wyatt remained still, his pulse steady, but his senses heightened. The low rumble in the distance was not a trick of the wind. Someone was coming, and he had a good idea of who it was. Sienna lifted her head, her ears flicking forward. Dakota pressed closer to her side, his small frame trembling. Instinctively, Wyatt stepped between them and the approaching headlights. His truck was nearby, but if he drove off now, he would only draw attention. No, he had to think fast. His ranch was not far. If he could get Sienna and Dakota there without being spotted, they would have a real chance. But first, they had to move. Wyatt turned to the Mustang. "Come on, girl," he murmured, his voice calm and steady. He extended his hand, hoping she would trust him just enough to follow. For a moment, Sienna hesitated. Her wild instincts screamed at her to run, But something in Wyatt's presence kept her from bolting. The engines grew louder. Wyatt made his decision. He grabbed a length of rope from his truck, not to restrain her, but to guide her. Moving slowly, he kept his eyes locked on hers. He looped the rope loosely around her neck, leaving plenty of room for her to pull away if she chose to. Sienna flinched but did not resist. "Dakota, stay close," Wyatt said under his breath. The foal's tiny hooves kicked up dust as they moved. Wyatt led them away from the outpost, deeper into the valley. The terrain would help. The rock formations and brush would provide cover, but they had to move quickly. Behind them, the headlights slowed. Voices carried through the still night air. "They are here," a rough voice muttered. Wyatt clenched his jaw. "Cole Sanders." A second voice. Bobby answered. "Tracks head that way. You think the rancher has them?" A long pause. Then, Cole's voice, low and certain. "I know he does." Wyatt forced himself to keep moving, leading Sienna and Dakota through a narrow pass. He could feel the tension in Sienna's body. The way she kept glancing back, she knew. They would not stop. Wyatt whispered to her, but neither of them replied. Dakota stumbled over a rock, letting out a frightened squeal. Wyatt winced. The noise was small, but out here in the vast open desert, it might as well have been a gunshot. The voices behind them fell silent, and then, over there, a gunshot rang out through the night. Sienna reared up in fear, the rope slipping from Wyatt's hands as she whirled around to protect her foal. Wyatt spun just in time to see the men charging forward, flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran. "Go," Wyatt shouted. Sienna did not hesitate this time. She bolted, Dakota right on her heels, disappearing into the darkness. Wyatt turned back just as Bobby lunged toward him. He barely had time to react before they hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt. Wyatt's fist connected with Bobby's jaw, sending him sprawling. Cole was not far behind. He grabbed Wyatt by the collar, yanking him up with surprising strength. "You just cannot mind your own business, can you?" he snarled. Wyatt glared back. "Let the horses go." Cole smirked. Not a chance. Wyatt braced himself. But before Cole could throw a punch, a sudden thunderous sound filled the air. The pounding of hoofbeats, fast and powerful. Sienna. She was not running away. She was coming back. Before Wyatt could warn them, the mustang charged from the darkness, her body a blur of muscle and fury. She reared up, her hooves slamming down inches from Cole, forcing him to stumble backward. Dakota let out a sharp cry, and Sienna turned, nudging him toward Wyatt. Wyatt wasted no time. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing Dakota by the scruff to steady him. "Let's go." Sienna led the way, kicking up dust as they fled into the night, leaving Cole and Bobby behind for now. But Wyatt knew one thing for sure. This was not over. Not by a long shot. The desert night wrapped around them like a heavy cloak, the cool air a stark contrast to the heat of the chase. Wyatt pushed forward, his breath ragged, his boots kicking up dust as he followed Sienna's powerful strides. Dakota struggled to keep up, his small legs trembling, but his mother never let him fall behind. They had escaped for now, but Wyatt knew the men would not give up so easily. The terrain grew rougher as they reached the base of a rocky hill. Wyatt's truck was miles away, and the thought of going back for it was out of the question. Cole and Bobby were likely already searching for them. He needed a plan. Sienna slowed as they reached a narrow canyon, its jagged walls rising high on either side. She snorted, her ears flicking back, sensing the tension in the air. Wyatt placed a hand on her neck, feeling the wild energy beneath her skin. "It is not safe here," he murmured. He scanned the canyon, his mind racing. If they could get to higher ground, they would have a better chance of seeing anyone coming. But climbing with a foal was risky. Then, hoofbeats. Wyatt stiffened. Sienna whirled, nostrils flaring. They were not alone. A shadow moved at the canyon's entrance, then another. The soft glow of flashlights flickered against the rocks. Cole and Bobby. Wyatt's gut tightened. They had found them. Fast. Faster than he had expected. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Sienna stomped the ground, her muscles tensing. She was ready to run, but there was nowhere to go. If they bolted now, they would be seen immediately. "Think, Wyatt." His eyes darted upward. The canyon walls were steep, but there was a narrow ledge about 15 feet up. If he could get Dakota up there first, Sienna would follow. They could hide in the shadows, at least until the men passed. But he had to act fast. He crouched next to Dakota, placing a steady hand on the foal's side. "I need you to trust me, buddy," he whispered. The foal let out a nervous snort, but did not back away. Wyatt reached for the rope still loosely tied around Sienna's neck and looped it around Dakota's chest, just enough to help guide him up. The flashlights grew brighter. Wyatt did not hesitate. He hoisted Dakota up, his muscles screaming in protest as he lifted the foal onto a small outcropping. "Stay," he whispered. Sienna watched, her body coiled like a spring. Wyatt stepped back, giving her space. With a powerful leap, she scrambled up onto the ledge beside her foal, her hoofs kicking loose rocks down below. Wyatt pressed himself against the canyon wall just as the light swept past. Cole and Bobby stopped, just feet away. "You see anything?" Bobby whispered. Cole shook his head. "Tracks end here. They are close." Wyatt barely breathed. One wrong move, one misplaced step, and it would all be over. Minutes passed. "Let us keep moving," Cole muttered. They could not have gotten far. Wyatt remained frozen as the men disappeared down the canyon, their footsteps slowly fading into the distance. Only when the silence returned did he finally exhale. Sienna's dark eyes met his, filled with an understanding he could not explain. They had made it through the night, but morning would bring a new fight. Wyatt knew this was no longer just about saving them. It was about stopping Cole Sanders for good. The first light of dawn painted the desert in hues of gold and crimson, stretching long shadows across the rocky terrain. Wyatt remained crouched in the narrow canyon, his back pressed against the cold stone, his heartbeat finally slowing. Above him, Sienna stood guard, her dark eyes scanning the landscape, ears flicking at every distant sound. Dakota shifted restlessly beside her, his small legs still trembling from exhaustion. They had survived the night, but Wyatt knew it was far from over. He ran a hand through his dust-covered hair, glancing at the path ahead. If they could reach his ranch, they would have a real chance. He had resources there, a place to hide them, supplies, and maybe even help. But it was miles away, and Cole Sanders was not the type of man who gave up easily. Wyatt exhaled sharply, turning his gaze back to Sienna. "We cannot stay here," he murmured. The Mustang did not flinch. She simply stared at him, as if waiting for his next move. Wyatt pulled himself up, his muscles stiff from the long night. Carefully, he climbed up the ledge to join them. Dakota nudged against his leg, seeking comfort. Wyatt instinctively reached out, brushing a hand over the foal's soft coat. He had never expected to feel this kind of connection again. Not after the loss of his own horse Briscoe years ago, the one he could not save. But this time, he would not fail. He turned his focus back to the trail. The canyon opened into a winding valley filled with dry brush and scattered boulders. If they moved carefully, they could stay out of sight. "We go now," he whispered. Sienna hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, Dakota close at her heels. Wyatt led them down a narrow path, sticking to the shadows as they navigated through the valley. Every few minutes he glanced back, half expecting to see dust rising from approaching riders. The silence was unnerving. Then a distant sound, faint but unmistakable. Engines. Wyatt clenched his jaw. Cole was not searching on horseback anymore. He was using trucks. That meant they were running out of time. He picked up the pace, urging Sienna and Dakota to follow. The landscape began to shift, opening into a vast stretch of desert. If they crossed it, they would be exposed. But if they stayed in the valley, they risked getting trapped. A tough choice. Then, gunfire. A single shot cracked through the morning air. Sienna reared up in fear, Dakota crying out as he stumbled to the ground. Wyatt spun around, his heart hammering. Cole and Bobby were closing in, dust rising behind their speeding truck. "Move," Wyatt shouted. He grabbed Dakota, lifting the foal in his arms as he ran. Sienna charged beside him, her powerful strides kicking up dust. The gun fired again, the bullets striking the dirt just feet away. Wyatt pushed forward, his breath burning in his lungs. They were not going to make it. Then another sound. Hoofbeats, but not Sienna's. From over the ridge, a group of wild mustangs appeared, their bodies sleek and strong, their hooves thundering like a storm against the earth. A lead stallion, black as night, raised his head high, letting out a fierce cry. Wyatt barely had time to process what was happening before Sienna responded. She neighed loudly, her voice carrying across the desert. The stallion charged forward, his herd following in a blur of speed and power. And just like that, the wild took over. The Mustangs stormed toward the truck, their sheer force causing Cole and Bobby to swerve wildly. The men barely had time to react before the lead stallion leaped at the vehicle, his hooves slamming against the hood. The truck skidded, tires screeching before it flipped. A cloud of dust erupted into the air as metal crunched against rock. Wyatt did not stop running. He held Dakota tightly, following Sienna as she galloped toward safety. The herd ran with them, a powerful shield against any remaining threat. It was not until they were miles away, hidden within the foothills near Wyatt's ranch, that he finally slowed. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but they had made it. Sienna stood tall, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Dakota collapsed beside her, exhausted but safe. Wyatt turned back toward the desert. The wrecked truck was barely visible in the distance. Cole and Bobby would not be chasing them anytime soon. He let out a long breath. It was over, at least for now. The sun climbed higher over the Nevada desert, casting long golden streaks across the horizon. Wyatt could feel the heat pressing against his skin, but it was nothing compared to the tension in his chest. They had escaped, for now, but deep down, he knew it was not over. Sienna stood nearby, her muscles still tense, her ears flicking at every sound. Dakota lay curled beside her, his small chest rising and falling steadily. They had run harder than any creature should, but somehow they had made it. Wyatt turned toward his ranch, just a few miles ahead. If they could reach it, they would have shelter, food, and most importantly, protection. But a nagging feeling in the back of his mind told him that Cole Sanders was not finished. Wyatt was right. A distant rumble cut through the silence. Not engines this time, but hoofbeats. He stiffened. Emerging from the heat haze of the desert, a small group of riders approached. 4 men, their horses kicking up dust as they galloped forward. Wyatt's gut clenched. Cole was leading them. Wyatt quickly turned to Sienna, his voice low but firm. "Go, take Dakota and run." But she did not move for a long moment. The Mustang just stared at him, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. Then she took a slow step forward. Wyatt felt something shift inside him. She was not leaving, and neither was he. The riders closed in fast. Wyatt backed toward a rocky outcrop near the edge of his land, positioning himself between them and Sienna. He reached for the rifle strapped to his back, his last line of defense. Cole pulled his horse to a stop, dust swirling around him. His lip curled in amusement. "You really think you can stop this, rancher?" Wyatt's grip tightened on the rifle. "You already lost, Cole. Walk away." Cole let out a dark chuckle. "You do not get it, do you? That Mustang is worth more than you will ever know, and I do not let what is mine slip away." Wyatt shook his head. "She was never yours." Cole's smile faded. He gave a quick nod to his men. One of them pulled out a revolver. Wyatt barely had time to react before the man fired. The shot rang out, splitting the silence. Wyatt dove behind the rocks as the bullet hit the dirt, just inches from his boot. Sienna reared up in alarm, Dakota letting out a frightened cry. Wyatt's pulse pounded. He needed to end this now. Lifting his rifle, he fired a warning shot into the air. "Next one will not be a warning," he growled. Cole's eyes burned with anger. "Get him?" The riders charged. Wyatt took aim, his mind calculating every move. If they got past him, they would take Sienna and Dakota. He could not let that happen. Another shot fired, this time from Wyatt. The bullet struck the ground near the lead rider's horse, sending the animal rearing in fear. The rider lost control and tumbled to the ground. 3 left. Cole spurred his horse forward, his hand reaching for his gun. Wyatt fired again, grazing the saddle, making the horse buck wildly. Cole barely managed to stay on. Then a new sound, a deep, powerful roar from the hills behind Wyatt. A thunder of hooves erupted. The wild herd was coming, led by the same black stallion from before. The mustangs stormed forward, dust swirling around them like a rising storm. Cole's men panicked. One tried to turn his horse, but it was too late. The stallion collided with him, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Another man was thrown from his saddle as a wave of wild horses surged around them. Cole was the last one left. His horse danced nervously beneath him as the mustang circled. Wyatt stepped forward, rifle still raised. "It is over," he said. Cole clenched his jaw. He was outnumbered, outmatched. For a moment, Wyatt thought he might still fight. But then Cole snarled, yanked his horse around, and galloped off into the desert. Wyatt watched until he disappeared. The mustangs slowed, their powerful bodies shimmering with sweat. The black stallion turned toward Sienna, letting out a soft, deep huff. She responded with a gentle whinny, nudging Dakota forward. Wyatt exhaled, lowering his rifle. It was finally over. He turned to Sienna, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're free now." The mustang met his gaze one final time. Then with a final nod, she turned, leading Dakota and the rest of the herd back into the wild. Wyatt stood there, watching them disappear into the horizon, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the desert in hues of amber and crimson. The battle was over, but its echoes still lingered in the air. Wyatt stood at the edge of his land, his rifle slung over his shoulder. His body ached from the chase, the fight, and the weight of everything that had happened. Sienna and Dakota were gone, disappearing with the herd into the wild. A part of him knew this was how it was meant to be, yet the emptiness settled in his chest like a dull ache. Wyatt had always believed that freedom was the greatest gift he could give to any creature, and yet watching them vanish over the horizon, he could not shake the feeling that he had just lost something important. A gust of wind rustled the dry grass around him, carrying the lingering scent of wild horses. He closed his eyes, letting the silence settle in. It was done. They were safe, and for the first time in years, so was he. Back at the ranch, Wyatt tended to his wounds. The bruises on his ribs throbbed, a sharp reminder of the fight. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into his old wooden chair on the porch, watching the desert stretch endlessly before him. His thoughts drifted to Cole Sanders. The man would not return anytime soon, not after being humiliated like that. But Wyatt knew men like him. They never really disappeared. For now, though, there was peace. The ranch felt different. The land, the sky, even the way the wind moved through the valley, it all carried something new. It had been a long time since Wyatt had felt a real sense of purpose, saving those horses, fighting for them, standing his ground. It had ignited something inside him. Maybe, just maybe, it was not over. Maybe it was just the beginning. Days passed. Wyatt spent them repairing fences, riding across the land, checking on his cattle. Life returned to its normal rhythm. Yet he found himself scanning the horizon every morning, half expecting to see a familiar silhouette standing against the rising sun. But Sienna never came back, until one night. Wyatt was closing up the barn when he heard it, the faint sound of hooves against dirt. Slow, deliberate steps. His breath caught as he turned. There, just beyond the fence line, stood Sienna. His chest tightened. She was alone. No herd, no Dakota, just her. She took a cautious step forward, her deep brown eyes locked onto his. Wyatt swallowed hard, stepping off the porch. He moved slowly, not wanting to scare her away. "Hey there, girl," he murmured. Sienna did not flinch. She just watched him, her ears flicking forward. Wyatt felt something stir in his chest, something unspoken, something ancient. She had chosen to return, not because she was forced, not because she needed saving, but because she wanted to. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small apple, just like the first night he had found her. He extended it toward her, his heart pounding. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, slowly, Sienna stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She took the apple. Wyatt exhaled a slow, steady breath. She was still wild, still free. But now she had a place to come back to, and that was enough. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video and share it with someone who believes in the power of courage and connection. Stories like this remind us that true bonds can never be broken.